Welcome back to Women in European History, Lecture 11B. Now we're going to talk about some of the leading activists for women workers. A little bit more first, some specific primary sources about working class women and children during the Industrial Revolution. So this is when investigations started happening into this as the labor laws were being revised in the 1830s and 1840s, in especially England, but also France. They took a lot of testimony before government commissions to try and get evidence about whether, in fact, conditions were really that bad. And the great thing is, because the British in the 19th century really liked keeping records, is that we have fairly detailed transcripts of those commissions. So, for instance, in this one, where the woman didn't give her name, interestingly, she was testifying anonymously, she talks about how in the winters she worked making dresses from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m., in the summer from 6 a.m. till midnight. And during the fashionable season, that is, when upper-class women wanted new clothes, that could go even further, 20 out of 24 hours. And that there were, as you might imagine, fairly serious health effects to that. I think a lot of you probably can imagine that, given that I know a whole bunch of you normally work second or third shift jobs and aren't getting nearly as much sleep as you would like to be. I don't know how that's faring for you right now, but I hope that everyone is at least getting somewhat of a chance this week to catch up a little bit on sleep. And one of the issues here is that there really was such a demand for labor, but there was also, because population shoots up during this period, because agricultural technology means there's also food surpluses. And so that means that it's very hard to negotiate for better working conditions when there are a whole lot of other people who also want your job. So here the line, "This is sure that there are some thousands of young women, and if one vacancy were to occur, there would be 20 applicants for it." This is a very popular song of the time, The Distressed Seamstress, that was specifically about the roles of working class women making clothes and so forth, and asking for compassion from nobles and aristocrats, not a lot of which was coming. Few particular women that I want to focus on from your readings. The first is Julie Darby, who lived from 1824 to 1874. She was the first French woman ever to get a BA, baccalaureate degree. And she became a crusader for working women's rights. Her famous book was called The Poor Woman in the 19th Century. She actually won an award for it, so as a research essay contest. Darby was herself lower middle class. She was one of 8 children. She was educated by her brother, who was a priest, and she became not just a writer and an educated woman, but also a governess, an entrepreneur, a journalist, an embroidery shop owner at various points. And one of her big mottos in her work was the idea that woman will become in society whatever she will be able to be. That she wanted to eliminate restrictions on, in particular, what kinds of jobs women could have in her advocacy. She also said, look, one of the big problems with the horrific conditions that working women are facing right now in the Industrial Revolution is that it also has really bad effects for children, and for male children even, sort of appealing to the men who were in power here. So she pointed out, after doing a lot of research into this, that infant mortality was generally about 2 to 3 times higher among working women than among well-to-do families, and that because these women were working such long hours, they would frequently deal with their babies crying by feeding them opium to keep them asleep for as long as possible, which, as you might imagine, does fairly fairly horrific things to the systems of babies and young kids. So that is Julie Dobie, sort of focusing on how to appeal, in some sense, to men in power to get them interested in working women's plights. Then we have Flora Tristan. Flora Tristan's sort of interesting woman, particularly in terms of her background. She is French-Peruvian. Her mother was French, her father was Peruvian, they met in Spain. And initially her father was very wealthy and well-connected in Peru, but then he died when she was quite young and left her impoverished and an orphan. And so she grew up in fairly desperate circumstances, was working in a shop, married her boss. That was an abusive and horrible marriage, but she couldn't get a legal separation until he shot her. Obviously not fatally, but that was enough to get the grounds for a legal separation. We'll be talking more about that on Thursday next week. And as you can see, did not live for very long, and indeed, while she was touring France advocating for women's rights, she fell ill and died at a quite young age, 41. And her argument was that women needed to strive for political freedom first. That the working class could only, as a whole, be liberated if women also had rights. And that as long as there were oppressed women, then working class men, to some extent, would be happy with their lot because they could always oppress their wives and have their wives as subordinate to them. In a lot of ways, this was a predecessor to what would later become fairly standard Marxist theory as well. And like Marxism, Tristan tended to have the attitude that she was going to sort of force people into the revolution whether or not they wanted it. She talks about here that I will go to try and unionize women and men, the workers who do not know how to read, those who do not have the time to read. Face to face with their poverty, I will compel them in spite of themselves to escape from this frightful poverty which is degrading and killing them. So there's a certain degree of I know bestest about that, although she was also very aware of the horrific conditions they were under. So Flora Tristan, here we are in the mid-19th century in France, had a nemesis, as it were. Not really a nemesis, but a rival in terms of theories about women's rights and what women should be doing to try to advance women's rights at this point in France. And that was Georges Sand. I've put up for you online several videos from the 1991 movie Impromptu, which is a gorgeous movie. You should watch it if you have free time in the next couple of weeks, about the romance principally between Georges Sand and Frédéric Chopin, the famous musician, Polish musician, who's played by Hugh Grant in Impromptu, and you'll notice a bunch of other familiar faces like Emma Thompson as well. So Georges Sand was also born into fairly high-class circumstances, even more high-class than Flora Tristan, but also fell into poverty fairly young, and in her case married at 17 in order to try and get away from her controlling mother into an abusive marriage, but then separated from her abusive husband, sort of paid him off and ran off to Paris, and then, because she had less money since she was paying off her abusive husband, started writing novels to make money and became a very successful novelist writing under a male name. And Sand's perspective was that the biggest problem that women faced was marriage, and that women needed to first free themselves from the oppressions of sort of patriarchy and marriage, and then work after that for political freedom. And that she thought that through her novels, she could persuade both men and women of what it was like to be an intelligent woman, to admire intelligent women, to admire capable and competent women. And that through that sort of gentle persuasion over time, political equality would come. Flora Tristan thought this was absolutely the reverse, sort of disapproved of her acting like a man and said, no, look, we need the revolution first, and then we will get the other approach. Lorcher stood as someone who, in the modern context, would absolutely have been a Bernie Sanders supporter, if that's a good modern analogy. First the revolution, and then everything else will come, as opposed to various other autocrats who say, no, look, first we need to persuade people of these ideas, and then maybe we'll get there. Other interesting thing about George Sand is that she seems to have been what we would think of from a modern perspective of as gender fluid. That she both quite probably bisexual, there's a little less evidence of that, but contemporaries like Victor Hugo commented that George Sand, who would go back and forth between male and female clothing, as you'll see in the movie clips, could not determine whether she is male or female. And Victor Hugo's response is, you know what? It's not my responsibility to decide on her gender. Which seems very enlightened in some ways for the time. But on the other hand, this got her a lot of hatred and attacks from other French writers like Balzac, who was a known misogynist at the time, who dreaded the thought that all women would be like George Sand.